Professor Heath Ogden, Associate Professor of Biology at Utah Valley University. Welcome to Faith Matters.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming to talk today about Darwin and science and evolution and Latter-day Saintism.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
First question out of the gate. I understand you're an evolutionary biologist.
Yeah.
How in the world do you manage to get a temple recommended?
Well, I'm the bishop.
Oh, well, that helps.
So that makes it easy.
Well, so the serious side of that joke is there still is a fairly widespread perception among Latter-day Saints that there's a conflict, an inherent conflict between science and religion, between evolution and Latter-day Saint doctrine in particular. And I understand you have some data to actually substantiate that dreadful fact.
Yeah, I mean, not just me. Others have been looking at this for a long time, but down at UVU for a general biology course. So this is a good representation of the general public, right, here in Utah County, and only about 35 to 40% maybe accept evolution with everything, maybe even including human evolution, right, at the beginning of the semester.
Right.
After a semester of helping them to understand a little bit more, they can change their minds, and maybe you get up to 75 or 80% change. But there's still people who, it doesn't matter what you probably teach them, they are going to, just not accept evolution.
And in your experience, why? I mean, that's an impressive improvement, but it's still a distressing shortfall.
Sure.
So why? Why the reluctance?
So we've studied that as well, because we've done interviews with students and asked them, what is it that you can, why can you change your mind and why can't you change your mind? And there seems to be a few factors that are important. One factor is that they have not been exposed to evolution correctly, and so they've got lots of misconceptions about it. Another factor, particularly for LDS populations, is the fact that they've grown up thinking they can't accept evolution, that it's not a possibility within our paradigm. And then a third factor is they've never had really good role models that have just said, I'm an evolutionary biologist and I'm a believer.
Yeah.
And it turns out that last, the role model effect in the study that we just concluded turned out to be the most important factor, actually, was just the fact that if there's an evolutionary biologist or a role model that can say, I believe in deity or in God or whatever, but I also accept evolution and everything that it entails.
Let me ask a couple of questions for the benefit of those who still do have reservations or still do perceive contradictions or tensions. One criticism of evolution that comes from a number of prominent intellectuals, I'm thinking of both philosophers and cosmologists, I'm thinking of Tom Nagel, John Joe McFadden, or Stuart Kaufman. There's a whole subcategory, it seems to me, of thinkers today who are arguing that Darwin is good insofar as he goes, but Darwinian evolution is wholly inadequate to the task of fully accounting for the complexity and the relative rapidity of evolutionary development on the Earth. And so they're looking to make way for other additives to the theory that don't really go into the intelligent design camp, but looking for principles of self-organization, those kinds of things. What do you have to say about that general?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that evolution does a wonderful job at explaining the diversity of life on this planet.
So you don't think it needs
we don't need an assist, really. Now, there are certain aspects that we don't fully understand yet, and that's the great thing about science. Science is tentative, science is humble, and it recognizes it doesn't know everything, and it recognizes that it's willing to change if new data says you need to go in a new direction. For example, speciation. We don't fully understand everything about speciation yet. We're getting close, and we'll be better, right, at that. And so I think that though the pattern that has been shown since Darwin and coming forward, because we've learned a lot about evolution since Darwin, right, a lot.
Yeah.
And so what's great about Darwin's idea is that it's absolutely been supported by all of the evidence that has come forward. That's the hallmark of a great idea. And so there is no need to start to invoke other kinds of things within the evolutionary history. Now, there are areas like in Nagel's book where he talks about consciousness. We don't have a good understanding of that. But I don't know that it's necessary to immediately invoke deity. in a gap of our knowledge, because history has shown that when we do that, science fills in that gap, and then what does that do?
Although in his case, he doesn't invoke deity, right? He invokes principles of self-organization.
Yeah. And maybe there is. I mean, we don't know. I mean, there's right now. How would you test that in the scientific framework? That there's some supernatural.
Well, that's why he's a philosopher.
Right. Exactly. So we don't know that there is this. We don't just don't have a way with dealing that.
What I love about their direction. I want to push this just a little further because I'm a fan of the Pratts as early theologians, and Orson Pratt and his theories of panpsychism. The intelligence that is inherent in all creation. It sounds very, very much like a Thomas Nagel or a Stuart Kauffman. And it seems to me that their ideas allow us to move in the direction of finding a role for not direct intervention on the part of God, but for principles of intelligence and other eternal ideals that are important to Latter-day Saints without sacrificing Darwin.
And what I thought of when I was reading those parts was actually spirit as matter. It's just purer and finer, right? And we don't know how to detect it and to measure it. Now, there may be a point when science has those tools. I don't know. Maybe not.
Right.
But I'm willing to accept that worldview that Joseph Smith gave us, that everything is in some way intelligent, and everything is somehow part of the universe and is material. So, because sometimes people say, well, that's the immaterial. Well, I don't know. According to Joseph Smith, spirit is matter.
Yeah.
We just don't know how to deal with it yet in science. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. And so I like that idea, and that's what the Pratts also were bouncing off on, was that idea of Joseph Smith and Doctrine and Covenants.
Right. Okay, one other problem, or perceived problem in the minds of many. We believe that we are created in the image and likeness of God. And of course, as Latter-day Saints, we take that much further, more literally than any other Christians. If that is the case, then we can't embrace a doctrine which holds or maintains that as we now exist, as the end of this long process, is purely the result of randomness and chance, right? Because we believe all along we had to be evolving toward an anthropomorphic, right, godlike being. And according to people like Richard Dawkins and others, if you were to replay the tape of evolution again, we would come out with completely different results. So those two seem to me to be fundamentally incompatible.
Well, yeah, except for it's not completely different results. There are physics at play, and the physics put boundaries upon what would happen if you did rerun the clock. Now, a great example of this is actually look at Australia and the rest of the world. Right? In Australia, their mammals, which were the marsupials, were confined to just Australia. But you watched that evolutionary history play out. What did they develop? A wolf, a rat, even a bipedal kind of organism, and a bunch of other things, moles even. And then you go and look at the rest of the world where there were placental mammals. What did you get? A wolf, a mole, a rat, even like a flying squirrel. There's a flying squirrel that's a placental, and there's a flying squirrel that's a marsupial.
Completely separate lines of evolution.
And they're completely separate lines of evolution. So what it teaches us is that the same pressures that are being placed because of physics, chemistry, and the environment, because there are similar niches in Australia as there are in other parts of the world, though evolution, as it's tinkering, it found body forms and types and morphologies that were repeatedly created over and over again.
Okay. That's pretty satisfactory.
And so, if again, we can't do this, but if we could go out into the universe and look at other worlds, I mean, that's the experiment right there. Do other worlds also go through an evolutionary process where maybe they end up with a humanoid form? Why not? Sure, why not? Yeah. I see no reason why that's not a possibility, because you would always want to have something that has a large head. If you're in water and moving around, you want a large head with all of your sensory structures up on that part of the head.
Right.
If you want to get out of the water, you need limbs. 4 limbs was a good idea, but 6 limbs has worked just fine for the insects. But you would probably, there's no reason that you wouldn't maybe also produce that kind of a figure. At least I see no problem with that.
Okay.
So,
one more elephant in the room we have to address, and that is Adam. In earlier generations of church history, prominent thought leaders insisted that evolution was radically incompatible with the belief that Adam was the first human, and that he's not millions of years old. So where do we go with that one?
Well, the great thing about this problem of Adam and Eve is the church multiple times has said we don't have an official position on this. Okay? And you can go to the New Era 2016 October issue there, and it says we don't have an official position. However, in that same one, then they start to give a few ideas that seem incompatible with what we know about science. Here's how I think about it. When it says first man, I can only interpret that in light of all of the evidence that I know about human evolution, about the physical body of Homo sapiens evolving. So in light of all of that evidence that I've learned about, the only compatible, reconciling way that I can do this right now, maybe there's another way, but first man must include Homo sapien body, spiritual offspring of Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother, and learns about the gospel and makes covenants with that deity. And that's what made Adam and Eve special, and that's what made them the first.
Okay.
They were the first to make covenants.
Good. Yeah, I think embraced, in my own views, a very similar position. I was influenced by the thinking of Kenneth Miller. Is that the right name?
Kenneth Miller.
The Catholic evolutionary biologist, who, trying to reconcile evolution with his Catholic theology, makes the argument that God allowed evolutionary processes to unfold without direction and randomly. And when a being arrived on the scene capable of entering into relationship with God, at that moment God placed a spirit.
The breath of life was
and called that person Adam.
Yeah.
So
that's kind of, and so that relaxes the assumption, first of all, of where they had to live, when they had to live, and how long they had to be in the Garden of Eden.
Right.
If you just take all of that away, it then relaxes that assumption, and then it seems like this whole problem of trying to reconcile Adam and Eve with scientific evidence concerning human evolution, it just bubbles away when you do that. Yeah.
What about the origin of life itself? Is that a perceived problem? Unjustifiably maybe, but do many students anticipate that Darwin is making a claim to give an explanation for that?
Yeah, students come with that misconception, and so does the general public. Clearly, the theory of evolution really doesn't say anything about the origin of life. That's a completely separate but related idea. And I would say that science is really close to having a really good working theory. Probably I would still call it a hypothesis. There's a hypothesis of the origin of life, and it has to do with RNA molecules being able to both carry information and perform reactions, have some sort of reactive ability, and that there's a membrane, and so you finally have this kind of like simple cell, right? But that organization, that origin of the first cell has no bearing on whether evolution is the explanation for the diversity of life from every. It's two separate problems.
And that's why I call it the origin of species, not the origin of life.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, final question. Are you willing to acknowledge any unresolved apparent problems or conflicts with which science presents the believer, especially in the area of evolutionary biology?
So I'm not sure if I understand the question. So do I still see that there is conflict between my own worldview and what science has taught me?
Yeah, in any regard whatsoever. Or where you could sympathize with a student who says, yeah, I still can't quite buy into the modern scientific kind of corpus of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I can sympathize with the students who think that, but that's because I went through that same process. When I was a 19-year-old going out on the mission, I was a young Earth creationist. And so I'm embarrassed by the things that I taught because I was reading works that were saying no death before the fall, no humans before Adam and Eve, and things like this. And so I can clearly sympathize with students who have that. What I've found, again, is that if we can clearly explain what evolution is, if we can clearly explain what the doctrine of the church is, and then if we can have good role models, modeling how to work your way through this, it may take a while. It took me years to get through this. And I'm not all the way through. Yeah, I mean, if new evidence comes forward, either theologically or from science, I may have to adjust my worldview, and I'm okay with doing that. I think that's a healthy position to take.
So if I understand you correctly, would it be fair to say that at this point in your life, you find your scientific training and investigations and research not just no longer an obstacle, but an actual asset to your life as a disciple?
It's enhanced my testimony. It's deepened my thought and meditative, what I think about the gospel. It has made God bigger, not made him smaller. It's made me appreciate him as the fully, he is, who's the best scientist? He is. Who do I aspire to be like? Him. And so for me, it's strengthened everything that I know. Now, that doesn't mean that I've had to get rid of ideas here and there that I always held as I used to be a very black and white Mormon. I've had to get rid of black and white Mormonism because I realize now that this world is messy. And evolution has taught me that.
Yeah.
This world is messy, and there's diversity, but with that messiness, you get wonderfulness that comes with it.
Your concluding remarks remind me of one of my favorite quotations from Brigham Young, when he said, "When the Lord comes and turns the earth into a glorified globe of a Urim and Thummim, a sea of glass, how will that be accomplished?" And he answers the question and says, "By the angels who are best instructed in chemistry." That's a shame he said chemistry and not biology.
Yeah, but whatever.
But I think the principle is the same.
Right.
So thanks for being with us today,
Yeah.
Heath.